And what up, you guys? Today we are looking at the last chapter of book 1 of MAUS, called Mouse Traps. As always, it's me, Rich, your anti-fascist comic book nerd, curating comics for your enjoyment as well as empowerment. So let's go ahead and get into this comic now. Chapter 6, Mouse Trap. And this is a much lighter chapter than the last one, and I think for anyone reading this, like, you need that after them, and the panels of them, literally slamming children against walls, like, that's rough. But this one begins with Mala griping with his father, and ultimately she begins to say how despicable the father is. And this chapter ends in a full circle moment where, as well, Art Spiegelman in a sense agrees with Mala and is a bit aggressive and rude to the father. But ultimately that's what happens here. And they talk about the importance of this book, and they talk about how it's a heavy and dark topic and theme, and at the time, at least, a lot of comic books didn't really tackle those kind of topics and themes. And so even the father, who's not big into comic books, was like, I can see the value of this work that you're doing, son. And so they go to the garden to converse about this, right, to continue the story and the saga. And the sad part is that they talk about all these people that they knew that were Polish folks that ultimately turned their backs, right? So this was the nanny. I forget what chapter it was, but this was the nanny that was helping them take care of her chief. And she, Mrs. Spiegelman makes the comment about how Poles hate Jews and things like that. And she was the one that kind of was, affronted and felt a bit disrespected, right? And here she is closing the door on them, telling them to go fuck themselves, really. And then a neighbor recognizes them, right? This neighbor was a janitor that worked for her father's company. He's gonna take them in, but one of the neighbors sees them, and it's like, he still houses them for the night, but it's like, this is pretty dicey, man. I think you guys need to find something just a little more secure. I would have kept you, but homegirl seen you and she's saying a bunch of shit now. And so there's still Jewish folks that are hiding, acting like Polish folks, and it's the black market where ultimately they find sustenance and they find kind of their community. And it's just rough, man. Like, they go through a rough patch of, like, starving even before they even go to the camps, right? The food is scarce for everybody, and so he has to go out and make these deals and try to figure out and haggle and really try to get food, get candy, still find ways of comforting Anja, who's cold at night, right? Because they're sleeping in a barn or they're sleeping in cellars. And ultimately he talks about all these stories of how he had to have a steady hand. His hand couldn't waver, right? So in this part here, he talks about how back then there was 2 trains, right? And one were for Polish people and the other one was for Germans. He said that when he would go to the Polish ones, they would look for Jews, but when you went to the German cabin, no one would ever look for you. Like, they didn't assume that they would have the knowledge to do that. And so what does the father do? Always, I went straight in the official car. And so then he goes in there doing the salute, right? The Germans paid no attention to me. In the Polish car, they could smell if a Polish Jew came in. And, like, think about how fucking brazen that is. Like, that's tenacity, homie. That man was burning like a blue flame. Like, he kept the steadiest hand. Because I don't know if I could do that shit. To be in a train full of my enemies, I don't know, man. So he keeps making these deals with this Polish black market vendor, and they become friendly, and she basically tells him, like, I can let you crash at my place. Like, I kind of like your style. And then Anja's there, and she starts being very nice and friendly to her child, until, like, they start feeling like a family, and they're just there together. But things get rough. Things get shooken up, right? She is selling stuff in the black market, so she has her own heat on her. And she gets gaffled up by the Gestapos one day. And then out of fear, she kicks them out. Because she's like, if they searched me and found shit on me in the street, what makes you think they're not going to come to my house looking for more fucking goods? So she shoos them away. They go back to the barn. It's cold. They're freezing. But she eventually bumps back into him. And I love this part, right? Because Art Spiegelman starts to kind of like judge her. And the father's like, nah, look, hold up, man. Like, although we paid her, she was still taking a risk, right? Like, she was struggling as well, and she had her own child, right, to think of. But even then, they viewed it more like they were cooperating with each other for the household. And like, he doesn't undermine the risk that she took in taking them in and housing them, right? Like, it could have got her killed, you know? And he's like, so even though, you know, people do it for money, like, she genuinely liked us, cared for us, and wanted the best for us, you know? But we needed to also put in our part, because we couldn't be that much of a burden that ultimately everything was on her to find how to feed them and all that stuff, right? Like, she herself was hurting. That's why she turned to the black market deals to make more money and food for her family. So like, obviously she couldn't just take them in as well and become, you know, and have more inconvenience to herself and her family. And I like that, because it's a very human look at it, right? Like we all want everyone to do the right thing, but like, sometimes people don't have the capabilities of doing that. But if you can meet them halfway, they might meet you the other half. And then that's how something, you know, that's how mutual aid works. And I'm all for mutual aid. And it just talks about like kind of the conditions that they lived under. He talks about so many close calls, and like how he kept a steady hand. Like this one where all the kids started screaming Jew at him. And he's like, so I came out well from this, but the experience cost me really a lot of hairs. Meaning like it really shook the core of him, right? Like, as steely as his core was, it shook him a bit, because like it's daunting. Like, you know, the kids started calling him that, and all the adults start coming out looking at him, and he's like, I had to steadily walk through that neighborhood very calmly, and then play and jest with the children and be like, what are you talking about, dude? You know? And like, man, like that's some con man shit, man. Like, that's some charismatic steady-handedness that I hella respect. And then ultimately, this book and this chapter, the end of it all is ultimately he decides that they should go to Hungary. I guess in Hungary at the time, Jewish people weren't being treated as badly as they were in Poland. Obviously, they said that, you know, because Art Spiegelman and his father talk about how, like, why would you do that? And he explains to him how at the time in Hungary, the Jewish folks had more liberties than they did in Poland, but it got bad after. He says he was already in the camps when all the atrocities that happened in Hungary finally reached them. But at the time, they didn't know any better. So they try to migrate out of Poland and into Hungary, because just like anyone knows, most people will migrate to look for a better life, to find freedoms that they don't have currently, whether that be religious, political, sexual, you know, gender, whatever it might be. They're looking to find a freedom to their oppression, and that's ultimately what they're doing as well. And he finds his cousin, who happens to be living like in a garbage chute, which I didn't realize, but I guess back then, like, everyone had like a compost barn of some sort, and that's where he was living, in the compost barn with his wife and child. And this is the part that gets me a little like choked up, because Anja doesn't want to go, and she's like, no, like, I don't want to go. And the reason why he finds his cousin is because he wants his cousin to take his place with the Poland lady. And he does, and he says, like, she took care of him until the end of the war. Like, they lived in family. Like, that lady is part of their family. Like, they love her. Ultimately, the smugglers betray them. They sold them off to the Nazis, and they get taken off and go to the camps. And as him and Anja are going, they're just assuming like they're gonna die and never see each other again. This is the part that really fucked me up in this chapter, because I would have thought that Art Spiegelman would have understood his father a little better, more, after hearing the story. But and in the beginning of the chapter, he does tell Mala that, of like, he's understanding him better, and that like she shouldn't judge him so harshly, because a lot of this stuff is like residue trauma from these experiences. But even here, he talks about how he had a bad day, right? And trigger warning, because this is on the topic of suicide. But he had a bad day thinking about his wife who killed herself, and just feeling mad and frustrated at her. And All right, he says, after Anja died, I had to make an order with everything. These papers had too many memories, so I burned them. Art Spiegelman tells him, you burned them? Christ, you saved tons of worthless shit, and you... Yes, it's a shame. For years they were laying there and nobody even looked in. Did you ever read any of them? Can you remember what she wrote? No. I looked in, but I don't remember. Only I know that she said, I wish my son, when he grows up, he will be interested by this. And Art Spiegelman blows up on him. He tells him, God damn you, you murderer. How the hell could you do such a thing? And the father tells him, to your father you yell in this way? Even to your friends you should never yell this way. But I'm telling you, after the tragedy with mother, I was so depressed then, I didn't know if I'm coming or I'm going. I'm sorry, look Pop, it's getting late. I better get home. And the father, he makes more bids for connection with his son. But Art Spiegelman's over it. He's like, murderer. But what this chapter made me think of is a lot of things, man. And I guess I should reflect now that we finished the book, right? But, you know, obviously some of the clear correlations is like when the government is systematically oppressing you and like you could be murdered on the street, like that does something to your psyche, right? There has to be some sort of like trauma that occurs there. And that's why it always surprises me when people are like, well, slavery was so long ago. And it's like, yeah, but then there was the Germ Corps. There's years of that abuse for the African American folks that, you know, were abruptly brought here to this continent, right? And that's horrible. And like I can't even imagine what that trauma's like. Like my story is very different than I think a lot of folks. We're like, I'm from a native tribe in Nicaragua who wasn't colonized or taken over. We actually hid in the mountains is the way the story was told to me. We hid in the mountains and we finally started to come down and kind of assimilate into the local communities. But you know, I can't imagine what these folks have gone through being oppressed in the way they have. And that's not to say that, you know, indigenous people didn't have, you know, their own forms of oppression. And even myself as a mestizo man, like that, I haven't had my own forms of oppression that I've had to deal with. But I can't ever say that I thought that they would gun me down for being a brown man. And that's not the reality that African American people have lived with, but Jewish people have lived with. And I want to say, you know, obviously without a doubt, like there have been eras and there have been episodes of Americans, you know, killing brown folks for no reason, for sure. But it's a fear that I haven't had to live with. And so it does make me, it makes me feel mad when I hear and I read about this, and when I think about the kind of trauma that they're building and brewing currently, right, under this administration, and the way they're treating people, and who knows what that's gonna do to like humanity, right? Like I sometimes wonder if it's not that people are mean, but rather that this society is creating mean people. And you know, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But what I do know is that we should try to understand each other more as people. So like even Art Spiegelman in that last bit, like he's in the wrong. And we'll get into book 2 later, but like he, you know, he needs to empathize more with his father. Like what he survived was not easy. His feeling of betrayal that his wife killed herself, you know, like however he decides to mourn that, like that's not for him to tell him how to mourn that. It's always funny to me how like people will subtract themselves from the equation, but then want to jump in and say, well, you should have done, well, you weren't part of the equation. Art Spiegelman obviously wasn't there with his father. He wasn't consoling him. We read the comic that he wrote, right? That he didn't know how to console his father, and that he felt weird with his father's grief. Yet his father has a genuine human moment and tells his son, in a moment of grief, I did this thing. And instead of understanding, being empathetic, he just throws shit at him. I don't know, man. Sometimes I think we're crueler to the people we know than to people we don't know. But
I beg to differ.
And just like that, I had a nice conversation with my wife, and my perception has been changed, because she's correct. Art Spiegelman is also human, and he's also dealing with a trauma. And his blow up, when you think about it, is actually more born from the shame or the guilt that he talked about in his comic strip, of not having cherished or not having been there for the mother having even written these books in the hopes, like the father says, that her son will one day find her story interesting. And he had her for so many years and took her for granted, and didn't listen to the story. But here was the way to rectify it, right? The book that she wrote, her thoughts, and he could have grabbed that and included that into the story, and try to honor her, and have her live, many years through the literature that he made. And it was taken away from him by his father, and his father's also just a human being dealing with his grief, his way of Anja and him having been together through so much, but then in the end feeling alone, and feeling how she felt, and that led her to taking her own life. And everyone's just human beings dealing with trauma, and like that intersection of like one broken person with another broken person, it might not always end as smoothly as we wish it would. And my wife's right about that. Lastly, I guess the only other correlation with this book that I see with Common Times is this idea of like this cat and mouse thing of like people being hunted, and and people trying to find clever ways of not being found. And there's obviously a direct correlation with what's currently happening and that. Like I said, we might have to put something more fun in between this book, because I be reading this shit, man. I be feeling really sad. One of the homies put on the comments, he was like, "I've been drinking today, man. I can't watch this shit." And I was like, I get it, homie. There's days where I'm like, I don't know if I can even read this today. But alright, you guys, as always, man, thank you guys so much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll be back with some more anti-fascist comic book reading sooner than later. Alright, you guys, lates.